All right. Well, thanks for, I'm sure you did better off without me last week, but I hated to miss it because I thought those were really interesting chapters.
We missed you.
I really was sad to be gone.
Alex did a nice job too. by the
Good,
way.
good.
Yes.
I would have
Yeah.
preferred to have been there last week to this week, to be honest. Yeah, I don't know. Like this one is just not as juicy. It's very weird, if you don't mind me saying. It's a very strange chapter.
It is.
He's talking out of both sides of his mouth and he admits it. And
Yeah.
yeah,
As a divorced woman, I'm not sure what I should think.
And as a widow,
If I'm right or wrong.
you know.
Yeah.
well, it's an
widows
interesting.
are handled one way here, but a different way here.
Yeah, it's interesting to hear, 1 Corinthians 7:39, a woman is bound to her husband as long as he lives. That's an interesting line, isn't it? I actually went to what was advertised as a open discussion between a New Testament scholar named Robert Gagnon, who has wrote the biblical point of view that is anti same-sex relationships. And he was debating Gene Robinson, the first openly gay bishop of the Episcopal Church. And it was so sad. It was so sad because Robert Gagnon, who is very well known actually in the evangelical world, said there is no such thing as divorce. Look, there's this particular verse. That was a very interesting argument, frankly, without any compassion,
Yeah.
with no compassion at all. So divorce is a pretend institution because a woman is bound to her husband as long as he lives. And it was very, very steeped in patriarchy because you notice that a man is not bound to a wife as long as he lives. And so what he said is there's no such thing as polygamy, there's polygyny, which is having multiple women. So it was tough. And I don't know if you've heard Gene Robinson speak, but like, he's like a nice man, he's a nice man. So it was a very bizarre thing to hear one person essentially saying divorce isn't real, even if you're abused and battered, like that's not real. And neither Gene is your, life. And Gene's like, but like, I think God loves us and wants to enjoy our lives. Like, it's just a very, it was strange. It was bizarre. It was really bizarre. Yeah, because they weren't actually talking to each other at all. One was making an argument on power, and then the other was trying to say, but how are we supposed to live? And so it didn't end up going well as a dialogue. Yeah.
Yeah, and where do you draw the line? When do you think divorce is okay, or other times when it's okay? I saw this episode last night of New Amsterdam, which is a hospital TV show. I don't know if anybody's seen it, but it's great. It's like a drama, and all of these things happen. It's based on the Bellevue Hospital in New York, which is the oldest operating hospital in the United States. And it's like Breckenridge and Austin. I don't know what there is here, but it's, a lot of indigent people too. They take everybody. And this couple had a little boy who was dying of some sort of he had to have a kidney. And so they did the replacement, but they can't afford the immunosuppressant drugs. And so the little boy's dying because they couldn't afford the medicine. It was $1,000 a month for the medicine for their son. And they quit giving it to him every day. So he started getting very sick, and they got to the hospital, and it was the one in New York, of course. And so the Pope was coming, just so happened. And these people were Catholic. And the doctor told them, if you get a divorce, you'll be single parents, and the mother, still live together, but the mother can get money from the state to pay for all this medicine because you're divorced and she doesn't have a job. So just on paper, get a divorce. And that's how you can save your little boy, because he was about 7 years old and he was dying. And they said, we're Catholic, we can't get a divorce, we'll go to hell. We can't. And so they were torn between, going to hell or saving their little boy. And so, the Pope's right-hand man was coming down the hall and the doctor went and got him and said, we need a consultation with you. And he brought him into the parents. And they told the situation of get a divorce or let our son die. And the man said, God bless you. Go in peace, get your divorce. It's okay. It's okay. God doesn't work that way. You know, he's not gonna let your son die just over something like that. So I think that was a great episode. I mean, there are cases too, and then I've been divorced more than once. Am I gonna go to hell? I don't think so. I think we do the best that we can. And we grow from the experience.
Those sound like stories where you're like trying to balance like the present and precious life that you have.
Yes.
I mean, you know, it's like you want life eternal and you believe in it regardless, right? Like in that situation, you know, for those people, it's like you believe in life eternal, you think it's definitely real. But it's like the quality of your eternal life. And as much as you value and appreciate whatever is happening, that's the most important thing happening to you in your present moment. You're thinking, yeah, but it's not forever. So no matter how valuable and no matter how precious it isn't forever. So you're constantly like that question of like, what is life-giving? Like, what's the life-giving read? What's the life-giving action? What's the life-giving? And I have found that question so profound and I so appreciate it. And it's helped me have like a real life-affirming perspective. And it's just, it's tough because for a lot of people who live with the very, you know, that's so real for them. It's like they're choosing between life and life. And they love their children so much that maybe they're willing to jeopardize the eternal quality of their eternal life, but they still just feel irrevocably torn. Like maybe I could be miserable for a while here or brutalized or lose my present. I mean, you know, it's just, I used to, I don't know, I guess whenever like looking at stuff like this, it's just fascinating because it's like you're choosing between like some evil existence now that for some reason equals good and you get rewarded for later, or you get to have good now and you punish for it forever.
Yeah, that doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, it doesn't make any
That
sense.
makes sense.
And it's all just based on like this totally arbitrary set of rules that Christ didn't even say. Like some guy who thought his teaching was cool and went around telling other people about it, thought it was good.
I kind
Not that I
of,
have no respect for the rule or anything, I'm just saying. Sorry.
sorry, I thought you were done.
No, I was, but
No, I was just saying, like, I realize it's like a TV show, but there are people that kind of act like this, and I'm like, if you really believed, really believed it's that easy to like slip through God's grace and in like an eternal punishment and torment, why would you even have children? Like, why would you even bring a kid into that? If it's like, oh, it's super easy, you're gonna be tortured for an incomprehensible amount of time. Like, I wonder how much people actually in their hearts believe that. And it's not, on some levels they do, on some levels they don't, on another level they do.
I agree with you. I think no one who's sane would believe in torturing someone forever and not having a second chance. Nobody would. And so then, you know, the way I feel like it, God's insane if that's true.
Well,
Yeah.
I think to be fair, we don't like make, like, we're not formed with intellectual propositions, we're formed by tradition, right? Honestly, which can be really good and can be really bad. And, you know, I do want to demystify the text a little and say like their understanding of heaven, hell, religion, and culture are not ours, right? Like they're different. And I'm not saying that to justify what we read, which I don't find like awful. I just find it a little confusing and jumbled. I hope you find it a little confusing and jumbled, because he says on the one hand, well, it's like nobody really should get married unless it's going to be bad, and then you can. And that's fine, and it's not worse, it's just better if you don't. Right? Like it's just a very
Well, his logic was at least consistent, what I found, and he was sort of arguing to me. Maintain the status quo if you can. If you can't, no problem. But maintain the status quo because it will prevent you from becoming distracted from you know, us as Christians, you know, glorifying God. So it's all this argument about the status. If you're married, stay married. If you're, but don't get divorced. But if you're not, if you're single, stay single. But unless, you feel you have to or something.
It kind of
you
just
know?
sounds like any pastor ever,
Yeah.
trying to give a,
Yeah.
trying to give a sermon on relationships.
And so he ends up kind of saying nothing. If he'd have just said, don't get distracted from the glorification of God, glorify God, it'd be a lot
But they had a
easier.
different culture. Didn't men have more than one wife back then? I thought they
Mm,
did. Or have
in,
they grown past that?
in Greece, that was not
Okay.
the common practice.
Okay.
You may have had concubines, but even in Greece, like less so.
Cause it's evolutionarily, we come from in our DNA for one man to have multiple wives, and that's because, back in the hunter-gatherer world, the women had babies, they couldn't go out and hunt, and so the men went out and hunt, they'd have several women, several wives, that's where that comes from. And we've kind of outgrown that, we don't live in hunter-gatherer anymore. And so women have a voice now, and we don't do that. So that's why I was asking,
Mhm.
because there are some cultures that still, it's a cultural thing. And that's what all the other closest relatives of humans do, so that one man or one egg protects the females. And so we have that evolutionarily. I used to be a biology teacher, so we come from that evolutionary background. And I like when the Bible says, when you glorify God and you learn the Bible, you rise above that animalistic behavior. You rise above wanting to kill somebody when they insult you or look at you the wrong way, that's what animals do. And I think our goal is to kind of rise above that. So, I don't know. That's just the way I've seen it. And so I didn't know if he was talking about one man and one woman, or if he was talking about one man and a harem.
Yeah, he is, but and I think he's also talking about a context that's not among equals, so it's helpful to remember that, right? Like, in general, women weren't exactly chattels,
Mhm.
but they certainly weren't equal to men in status, political mobility, etc.
Mhm.
Right? So not equivalent. I don't know if that's completely changed. It's changed some, but depending what study you read, there's a wage gap, right? So it's not total equivalence. I think the other thing, like Herb said, there's this word in Greek, the parousia, which is like the return of Christ. And it's clear, particularly in 1 Thessalonians and also in this chapter, Paul believes that's imminent, not imminent in geological time. Because that could still be true. It's imminent in geological time if it happens in the next 3 million years, right? But Paul thinks like within days or years, right? And so therefore, since it's coming, status quo, right? Like, why start something new that's not sustainable?
Well, that
And the
makes sense.
Corinthian people we saw last week are like, boy, let's take this new identity we have in Jesus, like, let's take it to its logical extremes. Like,
Mhm.
I mean, I've got to tell you, I wish I were here to discuss this with you, but like, when I read Expel the Immoral Brother, chapter 5, I'm not really sure where the immorality is. Because we don't know how old his stepmom is.
Yeah.
He could be older than his stepmom.
Yeah, absolutely.
He may not ever lived under her roof.
Mhm.
So like their relationship is it's social, it's artificial. And Paul says, no, that's immoral based on the culture you live in. And their argument, I mean, that you don't get to hear their argument. The argument is, we're not bound by our culture. We're bound by Jesus. And in Jesus, there's neither Greek nor Jew or slave nor free, nor stepmom and stepson, right? So like,
Yippies, doesn't it?
well, but actually it sounds like they're actually taking the logic of all things new more seriously than Paul for a second, if you don't mind me saying that. Now, again, we don't know how old she is, and any of that. We don't know that. But it's very possible, like I said, that they didn't actually know each other, right? So Paul seems to be not trying to, I mean, it depends, how we read this. We could say, oh, Paul's just trying to be controlling, or maybe Paul's trying to say, look, this is not going to be sustainable. We don't have a long time, so there's no reason to like do something nuts. I mean, it would be really interesting if we had 3 Corinthians where Paul's like, later than I thought, so here's the edits I'd like to introduce, right? But they weren't editing these things because they weren't widely disseminated, right? This was a letter he wrote and sent off and it was gone,
Yeah.
right?
He just sounds zealous, you know,
Yeah,
he
he kinda
sounds
does.
very passionate.
Which is probably why he was
to the
effective.
point of celebrating. Like, he just, yeah,
Yeah.
it's like, this is the ultimate prioritization of like your journey with Christ, and that, you know, yeah, just anything else is a distraction. And I really like the thing about being about counseling people to remain single, especially women, so that they'll be free from anxieties, because statistically, unmarried women and married men are the happiest people.
Unmarried,
Unmarried women and married men
Are the happiest.
are the happiest people, because unmarried women don't have to take care of men, and married men are taken care of by women.
Yeah.
But anyway, so that was
They
just.
make
what I-
them go to the doctor.
Yeah.
What you were talking about earlier, the guy.
I don't know if there's a philosophical point there, I just thought it was funny.
They do say that.
I learned so much at these Bible studies.
He does say he wants people to be celibate like him.
Mhm.
So, and then the whole virgin thing. It's like giving your daughter, is your daughter an embarrassment to you because she's old and she's a virgin?
Yeah.
If so, have her married. And if you do this, it's better for her or not better for her. It's, yeah.
Well, that's a cultural thing, isn't it? To
And-
me, this has culture written all.
Well, and
over
it's
it.
interesting to
Culture.
think through, and just, this is helpful to hear, right? Paul's saying, and I hope you read this in chapter 7. Now, verse 25. Now about virgins, I have no command from the Lord,
Yes.
but I give a judgment as one who by the Lord's mercy is trustworthy. Paul's saying, what I'm getting ready to write is not inspired by God. I mean, isn't that interesting?
It is.
He's saying this is not an inspired word. Now, why I grew up with the idea that the Bible's inerrant, and so what Paul says is inerrant, we didn't even read it. He says this is not inerrant. This is my opinion. And I think you should trust my opinion because, like, I'm a good fellow and all. But at the end of the day, it's Paul's opinion, not God's.
Right.
That's true, that's true. People kind of forgot that over the years, didn't they?
I agree with her, that it does seem very like, in terms of the back and forth on issues, though, it does seem to have like a very, like all of his logic, even though it sounds contradictory, does seem to have a pretty intense commitment to just freedom from distraction. Like, you're worried that your daughter is old and she's a virgin, and that's really embarrassing for you. Well, get rid of that distraction, just marry her off. And then she'll be in this like safe, you know, structure that we know women are taken care of under, and it'll be fine. You're gonna go get to, you know, I think it seems like everything is really, even though it seems contradictory, is just the sole focus of just removing any other distraction. And sometimes he's just prioritizing a man not being distracted over a woman being distracted.
And where do you read that?
Just like whenever she was talking, when she was talking about, you know, if your daughter is a virgin and she's old and it makes you uncomfortable. then-
I don't really get the whole comment about it. What is he saying about virgins?
Okay, so 736.
Okay,
If a man thinks that he is shamed by the behavior of his virgin daughter because she has passed the marriage age and he has not given her in marriage, and that he should give her, let him do what he will, and if he does not sin, let her be married. If he has sincerely decided and is not forced by circumstances, but has determined and decreed in his heart to keep his virgin daughter single, he does well. So then he who gives his virgin daughter in marriage does well. And he who does not give his virgin daughter in marriage does even better.
Can I read a footnote that my Bible has on this?
Yeah, please.
Said this verse is a thicket of grammatical and syntactical ambiguities. It is not certain whether the adjective, and that it's a Greek word, refers to the virgin or potential husband, as its gender is indeterminate, nor is it certain what means by post-pubescent rather than past his youth or sexually mature. Some interpreters even mean a state of being erotic. Like, it just goes on and on, like this got, you know, and that's like, because that helped me, because like we didn't really get to last time, the list of sexual immorality. That was maybe more controversial, but in this one, it says like this word arsenokoite or
Oh, yeah.
whatever. It said is, they. According to this, David Bill Howard, I don't know if it's true, but it said they have no record of that word being used before Paul. And then he's like, and it isn't used again until the 6th century AD as penance being prescribed for a man who commits whatever upon his wife, sodomy presumably, And then it goes through the centuries, like it's like the Vulgate said it's
Yeah.
male concubines. Luther's German Bible referred to as pedophiles. Most people say sodomites.
So wait, Casey, where are you what's?
Sorry.
That's in a
What's that?
footnote from
Yeah.
chapter 7, but the
Okay.
word he's referring to occurred in chapter 6, verse 10. The word is arsenakatois, and here's where it shows up. Neither the sexually immoral, nor idolaters, nor adulterers,
Yeah.
and then you see nor male prostitutes, nor arsenakatois. Now, the NIV translates that word homosexual offenders.
Geez, I have extortioners, thieves, drunkards, railers, defrauders.
We do have drunkards, slanderers, and swindlers as well.
Yeah.
So Bernie Madoff, poor guy.
And this one says the whoring, nor idolaters, adulterers, feckless sensualists, nor men who couple with catamites.
What?
Calvin.
Catamite, I think it's a boy prostitute.
Oh.
Yeah, so look, the church has always been clear, we don't love prostitution. So male or female, like we wish prostitution was not your economic necessity, right? So we'd rather not be a thing. But there has been a rub on that word arsenakates. It's often translated as the soft ones. And it's been really hard to know whether that is referring to the Greek vice of pederasty, whereby an aged man like Socrates would take on as a mentee a youth from the gymnasium that looked like a statue and may or may not penetrate them, but essentially have like sexual relationships with a man who was a mentee. So that's one possible, that's called pederasty, by the way.
Is it a young man?
Yeah, it's a younger man.
Because they still do that in Dubai. I know because my stepfather worked in Dubai for 20 years at an oil company. And he'd go over there for like 1 month and then come back here for a month. And he said they would live in camps. And the truck drivers that delivered the oil, all of them would have a young boy in the truck cab with them that was their concubine. And it was a boy, prepubescent, 9, 10 years old. And that was their sexual partner while they were on the road. And then the boy would grow up and be a normal heterosexual guy. And then when he grew up, he'd do that.
Yeah, this was very
that's
normal.
cool.
This was very normal in
Which
Greek
seems really
philosophical
weird.
society. Yeah, in fact, the Romans called this the Greek vice because the Romans didn't initially appreciate it culturally themselves, although Emperor Tiberius was pretty awful, it turns out.
Yeah, it sounds terrible to us.
Supposedly Caesar was the receiving it as a younger man of the king of Bithynia. That was like something that always a little bit of like gossip that followed everyone.
Yeah, and so this is a thing that happens culturally, like there's jokes about this happening at English boarding schools, right? And like, I don't know the answer to this, but I know that homosexual offenders is a really specific translation that the word does not imply. So again, what we don't know is what the soft ones are. Best guess seems to be pederasty because it's not consensual among equals.
Mhm.
Hey, I'm pretty also ethically against sexual relationships among unequal folks. That's
Oh,
why I'm anti-pedophilia,
Mhm.
not among equals.
Yeah.
That's why I'm anti-Bill Clinton, Monica Lewinsky, because they weren't equal. We call that statutory rape.
Yeah.
That's why I'm anti-David Petraeus, right? And his lower ranking colonel, because they're not equal.
Mhm.
And everybody in the military gets that's not right,
Yeah.
because she has less power than he does, right? So to say it's because they don't have different genitals is forcing something on a word that doesn't mean that. We don't know what it means because it happens in the Bible twice,
Mhm.
but it seems like it's pederasty.
Yeah, it is hurting someone, and just the basic morality of human beings is don't hurt people.
Well,
Don't
and I
exploit people.
wonder actually if that's part of Paul's own understanding of marriage in chapter 7. I'm wondering,
Hmm.
right? Because marriage was not a contract among equals in the ancient world. And so maybe that's part of the reason to leave things be. Now, I don't know if you know that. Does anybody know anything about the Shakers?
Are they like the Quakers?
No, 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 no. The Shakers were a radical movement in America. They were, men and women were equal. In fact, the lead prophet was female. And the way that she guaranteed female equality in the community is everybody was celibate. Because when babies are off the table, women are equal to men. They can do the same work in the field, and that's what they did. The Shakers, they did everything together. And within 2 generations, they were all gone because they didn't have any children to convert, right? I mean, you know, like,
They need to be several hundred years in the future when you can grow babies. You don't need a woman.
When were they?
Yeah.
1800s. You've heard of Shaker furniture, like that's them.
Oh.
Shaker brooms stand up on their own. I mean, it's a really interesting community in New York. They actually were really influenced by some of the First Nations, like the some of our Native Americans were matriarchal. They made decisions, and so this was like part of the information. Like the Oneida people were a bit that way. All that to say is what the Shakers emphasized was the celibacy for the sake of equality. And culturally, I'd just like you to think about this for a second. I don't think it's true. I just want you to think through. Part of the issue with particularly men with same-sex men relationships in the ancient world is one man's not acting like a man. That's the problem, because men are supposed to be dominant, and now there's a submissive man that's feminine. And that is an interesting thing that I hear contemporarily too, that men are dominant and women are submissive. And that, sorry, that's just smacks of misogyny to me. And so what's the solution for that? Everybody's celibate. And then there's no dominance. I'm not saying Paul's saying that. I wonder if he isn't flirting with that though.
Maybe so.
For the sake of men and women being equal in the kingdom of God, how do we do that in a culture that says feminine are passive and receptive and men are aggressive and active and dominant? Well, we just take that off the table and then they get to be equal. I don't, that's what the Shakers thought. I mean, that was a read of Paul. And that may be why he's having such a hard time here, maybe, because how do you visualize equality in an institution of marriage that is not based on equality in the ancient world?
Yeah.
We're getting better about it, right? I mean, since Ruth Bader Ginsburg, women can have credit cards. But that's 40 years old.
I read is a very big benefit of the doubt for Paul. That's a really nice.
I mean, I think we should give him some benefit of the doubt.
Credit.
I think it's worth giving him some benefit of the doubt. Why not? There's no reason to hate the guy. I mean, I think the truth is we bend things all the time, and certainly many scriptures have been bent. And as we continue to read 1 Corinthians, a lot are going to be really bent in ways they shouldn't have been, my opinion.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean the text is bad. That means what we've done with the text is not helpful.
So one different experience I've had reading through this version is like a lot of this stuff, it seems like it's confusing because it's confusing. Like there were some times where he's like, man, Paul doesn't really write this in good Greek. You know, here's Paul's using it, like, you know, he had the Malachoi, the soft people, but then it has male betters. He's like, no one is, if someone had ever used this word before, we don't have a record of it. And we don't see it again for 600 years.
Yeah.
Like that's confusing, not knowing the context of that. You know, and on another, especially on something, it's gonna be something that like divides churches, you know, or like denominations.
Particularly since his whole point in the letter, reminder, chapter 1 is stop being divided.
Yeah.
I mean, the whole reason for the letter is don't be divided. And yet the grist here has been some of the most divisive stuff in church ethics that there's been. I mean, one of the things we started with, you said, like, when is it okay to be divorced? Well, it's funny, right? Like, when is it okay to be married is another, like, equally good question.
So my great grandfather, he got divorced after 8 children. This is a family, you know, lore or whatever. And he came over from Ireland, and he and his wife came over. And after 8 children, she said, I'm not having any more. 8 is enough. And so she moved into another bedroom. And he went to the Catholic priest and said, my wife will not have relations with me. And so I would like to divorce her. And the priest said, go in peace. Yes. That was a reason. that was back in the 1800s. And so then he got a second wife. He came to Texas and got a second wife, who's my great grandmother. And then they had a huge family reunion about 20 years ago with both sides, and they all laughed about, grandpa, because this is years later. He's already passed away. But I thought that was interesting, the priest blessed him for that reason.
But I think partially we don't realize that marriage ceremonies, as we understand them, are much newer than marriage.
Hmm.
Marriage, per the book of Leviticus, happens when you have sex with a woman, you're married. Not when you have a ceremony and smash a glass under a chuppah, like a priest isn't involved. When you have sex with a woman, you pay for her. I mean, that's how the book of Leviticus reads. Now, if you don't want her, that's okay, but you still have to pay for her.
Mhm.
So like you're married and she's damaged goods, and now you've paid the bride price, because in that culture, you didn't pay a dowry to the groom, you paid the father for the property, right? So the oldest marriage seems to be you had intercourse and now you're married. The ceremony came later. And there is some really interesting things scripturally, like when you read Genesis chapter 2, the woman's made from the man, and then for this reason, a man will leave his father and mother. The man leaves, not the woman, to be united with his wife. How about that, patriarchy? We've been doing it the opposite way for quite some time. Actually, the groom went and lived in the compound of the bride's mother because the women chose the marriages. That seems to be how it.
So what happened to that? Because I've read that verse and thought, that's not the way it is. I mean,
It
tradition.
wasn't convenient, or the culture changed, so we didn't do it that way. Now the woman moves in with the man, right? That's been it. But actually, there's a book on this if you're interested. It's called Rediscovering Eve. It's by a Harvard-trained anthropologist who goes back and studies Hebrew compounds, and she says, no, actually, it wasn't like that. It wasn't like that. Agriculture seems to be what introduced the inequitable gender roles. Yeah.
Also, is it weird that Paul's giving all this advice about sex and relationships? Because it seems like, isn't it very bizarre for someone his age not to be married?
Well, so there's a lot of conjecture that Paul might have been married and his wife died,
Okay,
or that she left, but we don't know because he didn't write his own autobiography. But there's people who write, you've heard of the historical Jesus, but there's also people who write about the historical Paul,
yeah,
right? He talks about, all kind of conjecture, maybe he had an eye problem because he talks about, look what large letters I write with in my own hand. That's how he signs his epitaph. Like maybe he didn't see so good.
yeah.
We don't, there's just a lot we don't
Yeah.
know. But absolutely being married would have been normative.
Because when he says you should be like me,
Yeah.
I'm like, then why are you giving all this advice?
In,
You know?
but what's interesting is what could be the case, actually, 'cause this is all conjecture because we don't know.
Yeah.
Paul could have been in a married relationship, but in a celibate married relationship. And it's very possible that his celibate wife was an evangelist like him.
Oh,
And because they weren't having to worry about babies and childcare, they were able to freely travel the Roman roads and do what they did.
I never really thought about that.
I mean, I made it up, but why not, right? Like, because
Well,
we
it's
don't know
possible.
to the contrary.
So did Paul's teachings in this Corinthians, is that what started the celibacy of priests?
That didn't happen until the 6th century. And I think it was Pope Urban II who made that rule,
Okay.
because Peter has a mother-in-law, which means he was married, and he's the first pope.
Mhm.
So, no, I mean, marriage was normative, so much so, right? I mean, don't take this the wrong way. I'm not saying this is the case, but like, it would have been actually rather strange for Jesus to not have been married.
I've always. thought
I'm not
that.
saying he
Why
was or
did he?
wasn't, just that would not have been normal. And well, why doesn't the Bible mention his wife? Because why would it? Like, it was normal to have one. I mean,
Yeah.
again, I'm not saying he was, I'm just saying, again, like, there's normalcy here.
Yeah, I agree. I always thought that he probably did, and they just didn't mention it because. if he was
There's
a
interesting
small
takes on
person-
it. Sue Monk Kidd, who wrote The Secret Life of Bees, wrote a book called The Book of Miracles, I think, which is from the perspective of Mary Magdalene, who is Jesus's wife, who lives in Egypt for some time as a Jewish mystic. I mean, it's an interesting book. And she says, this is just conjecture, and I'm just wondering, right? And nothing wrong with wondering,
No,
you know.
wasn't Mary Magdalene the first one that saw him after the crucifixion?
She is the first witness to the resurrection, yeah.
That's one of the reasons people think there might have been a couple. She's the first one.
Yeah, and so I think when we come back to like, what do we do with this teaching? It is a little hard to figure. If Paul is saying, let's not be distracted, that's a very time-sensitive message that has expired, right? Like, I think we could use that message toward a lot of evil, like, hey, slavery's wrong, but the Lord's coming soon, so let's just keep it like it is.
When I read just chapter 7, I get no doctrine out of it. None. You know, he refutes everything he says.
Yeah, and he often said, and that's this, I love this in verse 12. To the rest, I say this, I, not the Lord.
Yeah,
Oh, that's
Yeah.
right. He says that several times.
Yeah.
This is my opinion. This
Right.
isn't from
he's very
Jesus.
clear on that.
Yeah, I think that I take a pretty simplistic read of this chapter now for some time, and I think it's in dealing with church issues, people issues. You know, he's been approached, he has all this information of widows and marriages aren't working, virgins, and the theme here for me is, okay, let's do that, or okay, do that too. This is okay. The theme is wherever you are when you're called to Christ. That's where you need to be. The goal here is your spirituality, your faith in ministry to the people around you. That's what the focus is. Whatever you are, wherever you are, that's okay. And I always had trouble with that because, yeah, it's easy to say for a master, for a slave, not so much. But, you know, but the thing where he seems to be going with all of this, wherever you are, you know, it's temporal because change is around the corner. Just hold fast, focus on Christ. And that seems to be, and we've turned so much of this into church doctrine.
Mhm.
When I think in context, he's speaking to a group of people in a community. And he's basically saying, wherever you are, that's fine. That's not the focus. That's not the goal here. So but yet I know in my denomination, we've turned a lot of this into church politics.
Yeah.
And that's really, I think, out of context.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Because if we thought Jesus was coming in 10 years, it might change things. If somebody was doing something really bad, we'd be thinking, no, it's not gonna work.
Well, you wouldn't need to save for 50 years of retirement. You just need to save for 5 or whatever, right? I mean,
If God was coming in 10 years, you'd get divorced a lot faster.
Yeah.
I don't know.
well,
Maybe.
and do consider, right? Like if this is a time sensitive consummation of the world, you probably would have a different ethic. People, when they find out they have 4 months to live, they usually do change what they're doing.
Yeah.
One way or another. And then, right, when that doesn't come to pass, well, now we have to like reevaluate that ethic, right? And so maybe what we say is, hey, the Lord Jesus comes again when there's equity in marriage. Not when he comes down from the sky and obliterates life as we know it, but like Jesus comes again when marriages are equitable. Jesus comes again when a woman is safe from a battering husband. That's actually like Jesus coming again when a woman is safe. So we have to redefine what the second coming looks like, right?
Yeah, it's interesting to that, it seems like, things can easily become doctrine whenever it's like, instead of thinking, hold the status quo and don't get distracted because Christ is coming again, it becomes, okay, well, hold the status quo and don't get distracted because death comes soon.
Yeah.
And so it's like, okay, well, whether Christ is coming soon in our lives or not, it's like, well, death is just around the corner at any moment. And so to me, it just seems like a very fear-ridden way to read the message of just like anything at any moment could jumpstart you into that eternal existence and you want to be exactly ready when it comes. And of course, I've heard that my whole life, but it's a very like emotional, and particularly quite a negative emotional driving way to live rather than like a thoughtful one. And by that, I mean like a mindful way, not just like,
Yeah.
an academic way. But yeah, I also wondered, and obviously this is just conjecture as well, but I also wondered if, like maybe it was just really distracting for him. Like maybe he was just somebody who, if he, I don't know, whenever like looking at the different things that he has to say and looking at, and, I mean, I'm not Catholic, but even thinking about that, I just thought, maybe he was just somebody who struggled with sexuality or, whatever, was just something that was really distracting from him. And the ultimate thing that he wanted most was just to have this like pure life where all of every resource that he had was like purely in pursuit of this thing that he valued the most.
Mhm.
But like he was still a human person, so he just.
Yeah,
was
and I
easily
would tell
distracted
you,
By these things.
I tell you, as a Protestant church, we decided that's not good for anybody. I mean, I would say, like, because I serve in this priestly role, if I didn't have a kid and a spouse, I could be on call all the time. And I could pour myself into the place all the time with nothing pulling me back. And that would be really bad for me.
Yeah, I just wonder where God is in that, because like, whenever I think about like, just like the nature of God, the nature of human beings, like watching things thrive. Not that anybody chooses to be celibate is doing anything wrong, maybe that creates balance for them, but it just seems like whenever there's, like, one of the questions was, like, what constitutes peace? And it's like that sense of equity and balance. And, yeah, it seems like that would be something that would create a giant imbalance in your life.
Well,
Right.
and keep in mind, if marriage is not among equals, right? And Paul uses the word, it's better to marry than to burn
Yeah.
with like passion, right? That's better than going to prostitute, right? But it's still not among equals. So I wonder if there isn't another way to read this, like, it's better not to be codependent. Like, it would be better to be celibate. It'd be better to be independent than codependent. And those aren't the only two options. Let's figure out how to be interdependent, because that's like where there's health. But codependency probably is less healthy than independence.
Yeah, for sure.
So it's interesting to think through this psychologically. Maybe Paul's advising, don't enter into a broken relationship. Boy, don't you know folks who are in codependent relationships? Some of mine are. I'd like to think my marriage isn't, just my partner won't tolerate that.
I'm kind of, what do you mean by codependency then? Maybe.
Oh, that's when you depend on another human being for your worth, and like your worth and value is based on someone else
Yeah.
instead of,
Not that you just help each other.
not that you help each other out of a sense of already
This is
attained
just-
worthiness and
Look at a negative.
Codependent people, as you know, are separation anxious because their spouse might leave them and fall in love with somebody else, or
Okay.
like they can be very, very controlling. In fact, when we got here, Rebecca went on some kind of cruise with a friend, one of those cruises in the bay, and she was going on vacation, and somebody said, "Your husband lets you go on vacation by yourself?" I mean, this was a very interesting phrase. She was like, "No, he doesn't. I just do it." Because that is how we do it. We agree, like, do what you need to do, right? That's how we what we need to do is reasonable. Like, we don't go off on it for a year and leave the other person to do everything. That would not be reasonable, right? But we choose to be supportive. I'm not saying I have a model marriage. I'm just saying that's a particular thing that we're not codependent on.
And that's a good thing. I grew up with my parents being codependent, and basically the way I see it is one partner says it's my way or the highway.
Yeah.
And it causes mental illness in both of them
Mhm.
when you're codependent like that, because you have a sense of power and control over the other person. And in my case, it was my mother, power and control over my father. And that's bad for the kids. You tend to marry someone like that. So I ended up in an abusive marriage, so, when the children grow up that way, they see that and they think, oh, that's normal.
And does the term codependency, that as you're using it, mean both have to
Both are,
feel dependent?
Yeah, the one who's in the weak position is dependent on someone dominating them.
And
And the dominator,
Mhm.
in my case was my mother, is dependent on finding kind of someone who will do everything I say, because it's my way or the highway. And then so that they're codependent
Gotcha.
on that unhealthy relationship.
okay,
Yeah, it's like your value comes from being able to control another person entirely, and this person's value comes from.
Being
able
told what to do.
please
Yeah.
Being able to
Another
please.
person entirely,
Yeah,
and it's like, that's your only
Okay.
kind of.
And all addictive relationships in
Yeah.
general are codependent because you're codependent on alcohol or you're codependent on purging after you binge, or you're codependent on exercise, right? These are
No one really
unhealthy
accepts it.
relationships with a thing,
Yeah.
which is really unhealthy with yourself.
Yeah, when you grow up that way, you think it's normal, children see, and so then I married someone who was the abusive part, because I'm not really like my mother, I'm more sheepish. And my mother's kind of domineering, and so, you tend to marry the person who's like, if you're like me, you marry the domineering person, and, I ended up kind of getting in trouble. Having a lot of painful episodes, so that's what.
okay, thank you.
I think this passage on 13, where it says, if any woman has a husband who is an unbeliever and he consents to live with
Yeah.
her, she should not divorce him, for the unbelieving husband is made holy because of his wife, and the unbelieving wife is made holy because of her husband. Oh my God, what a weight to carry. To be like, well, my spouse is an atheist, so I gotta believe for both of us. I gotta get us both.
Well,
to
actually,
Golden
this
Gate.
has normally been leveraged against women in abusive relationships,
Yeah.
that if their husband's beating them, they're supposed to go back and stay there to win them over for the Lord. I mean, this was happening.
Like,
It
to
still
show God's
happens.
forgiveness or what?
Well, yeah, because that woman might be the man's only hope for salvation. So she should endure the cross of abuse like Jesus endured the cross of Calvary.
Mhm.
This is what happened in my family. My mom, was Church of Christ, but I was Southern Baptist. He was a drug addict, alcoholic. They get divorced. She goes back to him and they ended up getting twice divorced, or I guess was twice as bad, but it was that whole deal of you can't get, it's not a biblical reason for divorce.
Yeah.
And you read these phrases to say that that's a huge burden for the woman
Mm.
to have.
To try to save your husband or to save your
Save
wife?
my husband's eternal soul. I
Yeah.
mean.
Well, does it say that?
I mean.
No,
I
that's how
believe
it's
husband
been
is made
leveraged
holy
though.
because of his wife. I think that's how it sounds to me. I'm not saying that's what's written there, but I'm saying.
Gotcha.
Coming from.
And you're reading where you see some of the negativities in verse 14.
I guess I'm seeing that and maybe like hearing. Probably an amalgamation of like different things that I've heard over the span of my lifetime from different people at church. And then I read this and I think, my son's father is a total atheist. And I'm so grateful because it saved me from like charismatic zealotry. And it really I'm so grateful for it. And so, it's not. Yeah, but I've had many people tell me, well, like, you need to keep being an example for him, and you need to keep
Mhm.
showing him God's way, and showing him God's love, and so that, pull him around someday. And it's like, well, or I could just accept him
Uh-huh.
for who he is.
Well, I
and
find
his
it-
autonomy.
Very relieving in that Paul is saying, you don't have to do anything.
Mm.
God has sanctified this person.
Which is a very different read, Herb, I think,
Uh-huh.
from the evangelical interpretation I was certainly handed, which is, in order to be sanctified, you have to say the sinner's prayer and accept Jesus in your heart,
Mhm.
which I don't hear in this text.
But I already say he's unbelieving.
Yeah.
Don't worry about it. I mean, the wife.
No,
I
you're,
read it.
because you're reading it generously.
Yeah,
We,
yeah.
we were given
Yeah,
a-
a very
actually
life-giving
a
read.
relatively
Okay.
abusive read, which
I
is
see.
it's your duty to save
I
your
see.
sinful partner.
Mhm.
And of course, then you're later gonna hear, well, you should have never married them. Don't be unequally
Right.
yoked. That's another one we get given.
Yeah.
So
I've
your
never
problem
heard
is
it
you're
read
reading the
any of
black
it.
letters on the paper.
Yeah.
It's not,
You're not reading the red letter version.
Or the letters that,
Yeah.
that are with all the stuff. You're just reading what's there.
Okay.
I mean, I think what I appreciate about what we're saying, and this is like, I mean, this is one of the first things that I think Nan said, like, or maybe Amber, you said it, like, like Paul's hemming and hawing because like it's difficult. And in some ways he's saying like, this is okay, this is okay. Of course, I think my way is the best, otherwise I do it differently, which I appreciate him saying that, because I mean, I think my opinion's right, or I'd change it. You know, like,
Or he says, this way is good, but the opposite way is even better. So,
Yeah.
so-
Honestly, from my
That's-
personal experience with people that ask me for advice, it sounds like he's doing it in a way, so if it blows up, he can say, well, I also.
well, I told you it'd have been
Yeah.
fine if you did the other thing, although I still think I'm right.
Because when I've been really uncomfortable before, I'm like, well, but then maybe, you know, and it's always,
Built-in CYA.
yeah.
He doesn't study.
Cause he does, and he, several times in here, he goes, well, in my judgment, or he'll say, like we read before, not I, this is what I believe, not I, but, let's see, no, I'm sorry.
Not the
Verse
Lord, but I-
12.
Yeah.
I, not the Lord, you know, and so he's, like you said,
Yeah, you know,
hardly inspired, you know?
with all the criticisms we have of him, and I agree with what you guys are saying, I love 1 Corinthians 13.
Which maybe he didn't write. We'll talk about that later.
Maybe he did. Oh, you burst my bubble.
Oh, chapter 13.
Yeah, chapter 13.
Love is patient, love is kind, doesn't it? He doesn't boast, doesn't pass on rudeness, so seeking gain.
About how everything will pass away, but love will remain in the end. I don't know, when I'm at the dark night of the soul.
Yeah.
I read 1 Corinthians 13.
Man,
I mean, sorry.
Oh, I was just gonna ask, have we read about prostitutes? Or is it
No.
still to come?
Well, we did last chapter. In chapter 6, we did, where he talks about sexual immorality. And I think a thing that we don't realize is like these prostitutes then weren't prostitutes now. So now there's like the red lights district, there's Las Vegas, there's like the Russian mafia. Then prostitutes were in temples. And
That's
prostitution
so
was
weird.
sacred and it was tied to worship of other deities, which is partially why Paul's like, don't unite members of the Lord with members of pagan gods. You might be like, what's the deal with that? It's just like a lady or it's like a man. No, it was happening in a sacred container in the ancient world. I mean, this is really happening in Canaan as well. This is why it was like really hard to purify Hebrew religion, because like it was based on food and sex. You went to the temple and you had sex with a prostitute, and that encouraged the gods to have sex in heaven so that there'd be fertility on the earth. I mean, it was like sex cult sounds like a niche to us. That was the preponderance of ancient Near Eastern religion, was sex cult.
So if your wife couldn't get pregnant, would you go have sex with a prostitute to?
Oh, you
try
do
to
it
get-
anyway. It had nothing to do with monogamy. Like no, I mean, that was your religious duty in Canaan to go to the temple, married or unmarried. Your wife had no say. You were going to worship Baal or Astarte or any number of deities by having sex with their vicar on earth so that the gods would copulate in heaven. Right? I mean, rain was considered to be Baal's semen hitting the ground, which would then generate new life. I know that sounds very
It
strange,
sounds so practical, like, so straightforward and practical.
but it actually made a lot of sense in the agricultural mind about fertility, whether for land or for animals. And so again, like you've probably heard the word fornication before. That's an old King James word. It's actually a Latin word. A fornix is an arch, and it had like a curtain in front of it. You fornicate under a fornix, it's the red light district. So the prostitute is under this arch, which has some sacral symbology. You go see her, the curtain gets closed, you fornicate under the fornix, and that's a form of worship, not physical transaction.
I've never heard of that in the modern world, except for these weird cults, There'll be some cult leader, and of course,
Yeah, there's one on Amazon called Wild Country, if you want to watch that one. Netflix, maybe. It's about this group, sex cult that took over a city in Oregon. And it used to be called Antelope, and then they renamed it Rotten the Peanut Porum or something. Like it's bizarre. It's happened in the 70s.
Are you talking about the Rajneesh?
The Rajneesh, yes,
Oh,
but
yes, yeah.
but it became a part of their freedom that they were just like having sex with everybody all the time. Yeah, the Rajneeshis, that's right.
Somebody a couple weeks weeks ago about the Rajneesh and they didn't know what I was talking
I've
about.
heard
Hell,
it
I
too.
got on a bus one time, I'm from the Bay Area. And I got on the bus one time and there were these people on there that were wearing, they were red. I don't know if anybody else is aware of them or not. You don't know who they're-
I know the story. Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
a wild story.
Yeah, Bhagwan Shri
Bhagwan, yeah, it actually started out innocent until they started murdering people, right?
You know who they was?
I don't know this.
Okay, so he had all these Mercedes, I think they were Mercedes.
Oh, no, they were Rolls Royces or
Yeah.
Bentleys. He had 17 of them, yeah.
Yes, yeah, and he's like in Eastern Oregon and there's not a lot around. Anyway, so he had people going out and I got on a bus. And there were two people on there that were wearing clothes that had obviously been other colors that were dyed red. So, you know, they just looked like hippies, just terrible looking hippies. I was seriously, because the clothes looked terrible. And then my boyfriend, so then fast forward. And we was like, oh, stay away from them, and then find out later what they were. It's like, oh, thank goodness we didn't talk to them or even sit with them. It was just, we were just. And then later, when I was in college in Oregon, my then boyfriend's brother got married up in Washington. And so we went to Seattle for the wedding, his grandparents and he and I went up for the wedding. And we stayed at a hotel and we went down to the basement where there was supposed to be a nightclub. And we were gonna just go dance and maybe have a drink or something. And it was a Rajneesh meeting.
Oh, wow.
And yeah, it was like, come on in. I swear, they like grabbed a hold of us and didn't want to let us go. I thought he was gonna deck this.
They're real into conversion.
But it was, but I mean, consider, like, we think of it as the opposite of a religious thing. In the ancient world, it was the most religious thing to have sex with a prostitute.
So they were the competition.
Yeah, and actually, when you hear, it's interesting, when you hear celibacy and adultery, those are like metaphors for abstaining from pagan worship. They're not just in our Western Judeo-Puritanical minds, like no sex ever. It like, don't participate in pagan worship. Be celibate from it.
And the recipients would have understood this like intrinsically.
Whereas we're like, oh, celibate means no sex ever.
Yeah, but they would have been like, oh, prostitutes. He's talking about like,
He's talking about
yeah,
cultic intercourse.
yeah.
But the Catholic Church uses the word celibate as no sex with anyone.
Yeah, and by the way, they didn't invent that. I mean, there's the Vestal Virgins in Rome, like that's a thing.
Probably
Right?
to do with inheritance, honestly, like most of this.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking.
'Cause when you die, your property would go back to the church instead of being divided up because it was pretty lucrative by that time.
But women couldn't own property, come on.
But no, I'm saying it would be divided up. You want to have offspring to divide up.
Yeah,
Or
fair,
legitimate
fair.
offspring that you can legitimately will stuff to and would return back to the church.
Yeah, which is like why eunuchs were a big deal in the ancient world. They didn't just guard harems, they were actually elite soldiers. They didn't have divided loyalty because they couldn't procreate. They didn't have families to worry about at home. They didn't have to send money home. There's nobody home, right? So they were great soldiers. The Arabs took over the eunuchs and said we could use these to guard harems. But Greeks had been using eunuchs for a long time.
Well, they made eunuchs as a kid and grew into
Yep.
that. And so they were.
Or
chosen
as teens, yeah,
Team, don't they?
yeah. After they'd have enough testosterone, but then they didn't need any more.
That's what you're supposed to do with the dog.
This is the
Let it
kind of
get
stuff though that we
testosterone.
don't read because we tend to read it like, oh, this is our world.
Mhm.
And we just forget this is not our world. It
Yeah.
sometimes rhymes, but it's good to pay attention to it, right?
Do you think that's one of the biggest, hurdles that we have or challenges that we have in the modern world is trying to understand where this is coming from because they were so different and their culture was so different. And a lot of this doesn't translate to our modern world.
I mean, I think one of the hard things I'd say about, don't take this the wrong way, but with what normally gets called like conservative or fundamentalist Bible study is we forget we have to know what it meant before we can talk about what it means. Because it's not just it means something now, it meant something then that is in some ways different, in some ways. And not all the time either. That's the interesting part, right? Like when we talk about equity and equality, which we're getting ready to do.
Yeah. I think that's a challenge, and I think over the years, people use this book in order to further power and control over others
Oh, yeah.
and abuse over others. They use the book for it.
Well, this is why I wish we would use Paul's, this is an interesting, we're gonna see it again later in the book, and we're really gonna see it a bunch of times. Paul gives an idiom. Like, this is a common saying, and I'm gonna refute it. And the saying is, mine even has quotes, everything is permissible for me. And Paul says, but not everything's beneficial. And that's interesting.
So what verse is that?
6:12. Everything's permissible, but not everything's beneficial. Everything's permissible, but I won't be mastered by anything. Food for the stomach and the stomach for food, but God will destroy them both. I mean, this is Paul's reminder, right? So like, sure, you've got freedom in Christ. You have it. But use it in ways that are beneficial.
Like he starts with an argument against whatever he's gonna say, and then corrects.
You've heard it said,
Yeah.
an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but I tell you, love your enemies. That's what he's doing. You've heard it said, everything's permissible, but I tell you, not everything's beneficial.
Yeah.
Yeah, context is so important. The other day I listened to Psalms, some, not all of it, but just some of it.
Yeah.
And I was just, and I've heard a lot of people talk about how beautiful Psalms is. And the section that I listened to was just so brutal.
Yeah, so.
That I just was like, oh my gosh, you know, and I guess I hadn't read it in a long time, and I was listening to it out loud, so I was just like I was listening to this man recite it, and he just had a very stern voice, and I was just like, yeah, I would never pray for any of this.
Yeah.
I would never, you know, I was just so wild. So, yeah, but you know, taking it so literally that you don't take it seriously.
So one last story about that, because Psalm 137, by the rivers of Babylon, there we sat and wept, concludes with, I wish that we dashed your babies on the rock. Right? And we just had this poet at clergy conference who is developing alternative liturgies. I mentioned this to you. And his alternate liturgy goes like this: the Lord be with you. And the crowd replies, we don't believe you.
Really?
Yeah. And he said, it's really lovely to give people the opportunity to say, we don't believe you. And then what's my response? Okay, let us pray. I mean, that's just really interesting to think about that.
Yeah, that's incredible. It's also a delightful challenge to yourself to be like, do I mean that?
And I'm going to pray
in.
anyway. I mean, I think that's the interesting thing. I may not feel it and I choose to return, right?
Yeah.
And there's an interesting thing where you say, I hope your babies get dashed to the rock, but then you don't do that. You leave that emotion with God, which is like much healthier than pretending you don't have that emotion. So it's interesting that the Bible is a lot more wild and free and representative than we'd like it to be, but it gets to stay with God.
Message shall he be.